Hi everyone, so I'm back today and we're just talking about preparing the miniature for priming, and then we'll talk about priming a bit. I'll talk about how I would do priming with a rattle can or spray can, because that's what I would probably use if I wasn't using a airbrush. Talk about other methods of priming, and then I'll show you the end result of doing one with a spray can with how I've described. These miniatures from the Dungeons and Dragons miniature game, they don't have a residue, at least on the ones that I have, and they didn't on the Wrath of Bashardalon as well. So I don't typically wash these, but just to be a bit more thorough, some materials, whether it be metal or resin, various types of miniatures that you buy can have a residue that comes from the mold casting process. And I think that in those cases that it's a good practice to wash the miniature in, just some lukewarm water with a little bit of dish hand soap, mixed in, and you just want to basically rinse it off. If you have a soft bristle toothbrush, you might even want to just kind of brush it a bit and to get that sort of residue that's off, and then just swish it through the water and just let it dry on paper towel. It's good because I've never had a really bad experience, but my understanding is if you leave that stuff on, it can be hard for paint to adhere, and you might even have a problem of paint sloughing off or chipping off easier if there's that sort of residue on there. And so not really applicable for these guys that I'm doing this series on them, but I just thought I would mention it. So as well, there's a whole bunch of preparing those kinds of miniatures that are attached to sprues and molding that I'm not going to go over because it's not necessary for these miniatures, because they come already basically prepared for you if they were, I'm assuming, attached somehow to molds and things. They've already done that. Priming, for the purpose of priming, is to provide a surface for your paint to adhere to, because oftentimes if you were to just put paint directly on here, it may not adhere properly, and so the priming provides that adhesion. Now, some of the things that are important for priming are, one, you don't want to do it in a way where it's extremely thick and applied thickly, because what that does is it obscures the detail within the model. And like I had mentioned in the last video, in choosing your miniature, if you obscure your detail, then you're kind of setting the stage for the rest of the miniature. It really, it's what you have to work with, and so if you ruin what the sculptor has for you to work with, then you're really setting yourself up badly to be able to essentially have a good product at the end. So there are a number of different kinds of primers out there, and I'd mentioned that I normally use the airbrush, and the reason I do that is that I feel I can get the thinnest coat on there to basically provide that adhesion, but not actually obscure detail. And that oftentimes for me happens with the airbrush. Now, I use, most often you'll see for my miniatures, I use something like this, which is what they call an acrylic polyurethane surface primer, and this one's by Vallejo. And so that's what I would use for that effect. You usually, I think, can brush these on as well, although it will be right off the bat thicker still, because you're not spraying it through an airbrush, so it's still going to be a thicker medium. But you can use most airbrush primers with a brush as well. The other options are regular rattle cans, which I always call them spray cans, but I noticed lots of folks call them rattle cans. And so this is just Krylon. It's just a black plain primer, fairly cheap and inexpensive, and from what I've read on forums and just other people that are into this, many of them are very successful with this really easily accessible, available, cheaper product, because you'll notice that things that tend to be specific for this hobby are usually double to triple the cost. And so when you can find something that's just as good, maybe it's a manufacturer that just specializes in spray paint and priming, and so even though they're cheaper, it's because of the volumes and things that they sell and provide to the industry that you get an equally as good product for cheaper. And so I'm going to use this one for this, just to show you the result. As well, there's a product called Army Painter, which is actually quite good, and these are color primers. The difference with a color primer is that what it aims to do is not only prime your miniature, but give you that first layer of base paint. In some cases, that's really, really helpful, because one, if you can get your primer and your paint all in one, then you're not putting multiple layers of different things and then obscuring that detail, going back to kind of what we talked about. I did find that in general this provides a bit of a thicker coating than, let's say, this one. In some cases I'm not worried about it if I try to put it on lightly, because it does prevent me from putting that whole base coat on the model. If you're painting a model where it's going to be primarily one initial color, so if it was like, let's say, some sort of robot or a space marine, if you do 40K, you might have it where it's all one uniform color. That's really a good option, because you're getting that first base coat on. And a skeleton's an option where, if it's mainly white, so if you spray this whole thing white, you're really there, pretty close to being there with your base coat, so it's quite helpful. But you have to balance all of these things as to the effect that when you learn these techniques you're trying to achieve. Another option, which I've never had much success, but some people swear by this, and there are YouTube videos where people get really good effects with it, is this technical Imperial primer that you brush on by Citadel. I've found that it doesn't cover very evenly for me. I've not spent a lot of time with it, but I've not personally had a lot of good success, but some people do have good success with it. Another thing that you want to consider when priming is color. If you're working with acrylic paints, which very often that's what, in this hobby, what people are mostly working with is acrylic paints for their primary paints. There's a degree of, as I understand it, of transparency in all of acrylic paints, and so even though particularly when you apply them on thinly, so you don't actually obscure the detail, you always tend to see a bit of the layer below of whatever it is that shades or alters the effect of what you're looking at. And so where you start with your primer can make a difference. If you're having a really light colored model and you start with a really dark primer, it could potentially force you to put a lot more paint on than you want to actually obscure that. It just really depends on the specifics, the kind of paint you use and the primer and things, but it's something to consider. That's why if you've watched my videos, you probably notice I mainly go with gray, because I find that being halfway, or somewhat between black and white, it allows you, it's not altering the look of your paint on the first couple of layers that you put on nearly as much as it could. In some cases, if you're working with a really dark model, you may want to use black. In some cases, if you're working with a really light model overall, you may want to use white. I tend to use gray mostly, then I use black, and then lastly I've used white, but I don't, for white models I will, but I've not used it nearly as much. The other thing I found is that primers and paints together, for me personally, I've noticed that whatever they use to make white paint tends to make it thicker. I have some airbrush white that's quite thin. It's made specifically for that reason, but generally, even looking at these primers, this is thicker than the black primer by far. There's something to do with the pigmentation. I'm not an expert, but I find that translates into paints as well, and so you have to be sort of careful with that too when you're working with this stuff. So what I will do now is just mention that you generally, if you're going to follow the way I'm doing this for this video, you want to spray in a well-ventilated place. you want to, make sure that if you're not at a very minimum, you're wearing a mask. And obviously when working with a spray can, it's best to, spray somewhere where you're not going to get it all over the place. Like, I'm certainly not going to do it here on my workbench. I'm going to go to my garage, and that's why I won't be showing that part of the video. And I'll be spraying these on newspaper. I basically just, sometimes I'll tape them to a piece of cardboard, so if I'm with multiple miniatures, so I can do them all at once and move it around. Because there's only 3 here, I probably won't. But it will get to places that I don't want to on the workbench. When spraying, I don't know the golden rule, but I tend to stay a minimum of 10 inches away from the model, because what you don't want to happen is you want to get a nice even spray. You don't want it to pool. You don't want it like be right here and just spray the paint like right into your detail. You want to essentially be a good distance away, so the sort of aerosolized paint, which looks to me like smoke or something, is basically going in waves onto your mini. And rather than spraying, just lightly spray in the beginning and go back and forth like this. So you don't want to get too much. That's the main thing. A lot of times people really fret about making sure that it's completely covered, so much so that they obscure the detail, and you don't want that. So just, turn it around and kind of just basically give light sprays to just give a nice thin, even coat. I think as far as that goes, I can't really, obviously extreme temperatures may affect your spray. I find that, I'll talk about that more in the varnish videos, because I find that affects me more in the varnish. But I think even with spray paint, let's say if you're working in really cold environments, you may have some difficulty, with the way it actuates. Every paint may have some different directions that you might, that as far as on the can, as far as the ideal temperature ranges and things. But I think if you're working with normal room temperatures, you're fine. It's just realize if you're going out in the garage like I am, and I live in Canada, that, if it's really, really cold, it could affect your results. So I will be back with how these look with the primer on. Be back in a bit. Okay, so I am back. I have just come from the garage and finished priming these guys. So really the goal here was to just get as little as I needed to just cover the model. Essentially, I think I did that. It doesn't look like it's really, I guess, covering the detail. I'm going into his face here to see if I can get a good close-up. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. So I think I've pretty much gotten the effect that I want to. Right there, where I think that's really, in this model in particular, some nice detail is right here, and it looks like it's been preserved. One thing I will mention that I don't think I mentioned before, that is, if you happen to be working with metal models in particular, you may find that that surface primer, the one that I showed in the beginning that I like to do with the airbrush, may not be as good, because it's such a thin coat that I do find sometimes with metal models that they require a bit more of a substantial coat, despite trying to maintain a thin coat, like some really good adhesion. And people have had trouble with the polyurethane primer sometimes on metal models. I've still used it with success, but I do notice that metal models tend to chip a little bit more sometimes, and that may be based also on the choice of primer on the model. I think there's a lot of variables, like a lot of things. So, okay, so next up we will work on base painting, doing the first base coat. Thanks everyone.